begins just after Queen Victoria came to the throne. Jacob Marley had been dead for 7 years, and his business partner, Ebenezer Scrooge, was the meanest man in London. His cold-heartedness made his office chilly, even in the summer. At Christmas, the temperature was freezing. He only had a tiny fire and guarded the coal bucket by his desk. His clerk could not fetch a fresh piece of coal without asking. His clerk's name was Bob Cratchit. He sat perched on a high stool in the outer office, writing in a huge account book. He wore mittens, but his fingers were so cold he could hardly hold his quill pen. The ink was freezing in his inkwell. He wore a long scarf that he called his comforter. His wife had knitted it, for Bob could not afford an overcoat. Scrooge only paid him 15 shillings a week. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and the shops were full of Christmas good cheer and blazing with lights. Suddenly, Scrooge's office door opened, and a cheery voice cried, "Merry Christmas, Uncle!" It was Scrooge's nephew, Fred. He was glowing red in the face from walking quickly. His eyes sparkled, and his breath hung like smoke in the cold air. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug! What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." His nephew laughed. "What reason have you to be miserable? You're rich enough." "Merry Christmas!" growled Scrooge. "Down with Christmas!" "You don't mean that, I'm sure, Uncle. Come and have Christmas dinner with us tomorrow, and let's be friends." But Scrooge refused. "I'm going to wish you a Merry Christmas, in spite of your bad temper, Uncle, and a Happy New Year." "Bah!" Scrooge snapped as his nephew went out. "If I had my way, every idiot that goes about saying Merry Christmas should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart." As Fred went out of the door, he stood back to let in 2 plump, pleasant-faced gentlemen. They were collecting money for the poor to give them a bit of comfort at Christmas time. "Mr. Marley?" asked one of them. "Marley's dead. I'm Scrooge," barked Ebenezer. He refused to give anything to the collection. "Are there no prisons?" he demanded. "Are there no workhouses? I support those with my taxes. Let the poor go there." "Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "Let them die, then," said Scrooge. "There are far too many poor people." The gentleman went away disappointed. The fog got deeper and the afternoon darker. Soon it was time to shut the office. Bob put out his candle. "I suppose you want the day off tomorrow," grumbled Scrooge. "I shall have to pay you a whole day's wages for no work." "Well, it's only once a year," said Bob timidly. "And that's once too often," growled Scrooge. But he had to let the clerk go. Bob ran off. He slid down a frozen hill 20 times at the end of a line of boys. Then he hurried home to play blind man's buff with his family. Meanwhile, Scrooge ate a lonely supper in a miserable inn.
Drüben hinterm Dorfe steht ein Leiermann.
When Scrooge returned home, he put his key in the door and suddenly noticed the knocker. It was a big, old-fashioned one, with nothing special about it. But tonight it was different. It was not an ordinary knocker at all. It was Marley's face. Marley's face was a dismal shade of green, rather like bad fish glowing in the dark. Ghostly spectacles were perched on its ghostly forehead, and its hair moved gently, as if a breeze was stirring it. Its eyes had a fixed stare. Scrooge was not frightened. He did not believe in ghosts. He told himself firmly that Marley had been dead for 7 years. He entered the house, put on his slippers, dressing gown and nightcap, and sat down by his bed, after making sure that the door was locked. Just then, a bell high above the fireplace began to swing to and fro. It had not been used for years. Now it began to ring loudly for about a minute. Then came a clanking noise deep in the house, as if someone was dragging a heavy chain up from the cellar. "It's humbug," cried Scrooge. "I won't believe it." But the cellar door opened, and the noise came up the stairs, through the heavy door, and into the room, before his very eyes. The flame in the fire leapt up, as if it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost." And there was Marley, with his pigtail, wearing his usual waistcoat, tight trousers and boots. The chain around his waist was very long and wound around him like a tail. "You don't believe in me, do you?" said the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "It could be the result of an upset stomach. Perhaps you're an undigested bit of beef or a clump of cheese." The ghost took no notice of Scrooge's feeble joke. Instead, it gave a frightful cry and rattled its chain. "I made this chain in life, link by link and yard by yard. You have one too, just as heavy and thick as mine. But you have had 7 years more, so yours is much longer. I only thought about money. I lost so many chances to do good," sighed the ghost. "But you are a good businessman, Jacob." "Business? Human beings were my business. I neglected them, and now I'm being punished for it." "Why have you come to me?" asked Scrooge. "To warn you, so that you can escape my fate. You are going to be visited by 3 spirits, who will come to you as the church clock strikes 1. "I'd much rather they didn't," said Scrooge. But the ghost wrapped its tail round its arm and walked backwards towards the window, which began to open wide. The ghost floated out into the night air. Suddenly, Scrooge felt very tired. He crept into bed and fell asleep right away. Scrooge woke up with a start when the church bell chimed midnight. He lay awake listening for a whole hour, until at last the bell boomed out. 1. At once all the lights in his room burst into flame, and the curtains on his four-poster bed were flung open wide. There stood before him a strange small figure, with a smooth face like a child, but with long white hair like an old man. It wore a white tunic and held a branch of holly in its hand. A bright, clear light shone from the top of its head, and it carried a cap, like a fire extinguisher, which it could use to put out this light. "Who or what are you?" asked Scrooge. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" "No, your past. Get up and come with me." Scrooge got out of bed in his nightclothes and took the spirit's hand. They were suddenly in the countryside, in a small market town. Boys were riding along the road. They were going home for the Christmas holidays. Scrooge knew who they were, his old school friends. He began to cry. He remembered how he had been left behind that Christmas in a cold, cheerless schoolroom, forgotten by everybody. The spirit waved its hand. "Let's seek out another Christmas." It was the same schoolroom, the same boy, only older, and alone again. Suddenly, the door opened, and a little girl rushed in and hugged him. It was his sister. She had been sent to bring him home for Christmas. "She was never strong. She died young," said Scrooge. "And left one child, I believe," said the spirit. "Your nephew." "Yes," said Scrooge thoughtfully. Then they left the school behind and found themselves in a huge city. It was Christmas Eve and the streets were lit up. They stopped at a warehouse door. "Do you know it?" "Know it? I was apprenticed here," said Scrooge excitedly. There was a jolly party in full swing. Old Fezziwig, Scrooge's former employer, was celebrating Christmas with his family and work people, and there was a fiddler playing for country dancing. Scrooge was delighted. He enjoyed it all as much as he had all those years ago. At the end, he looked up at the spirit. "Is anything the matter?" asked the spirit. "No," said Scrooge. "I just wish I could say a word to my clerk, that's all." The next picture was not so cheerful. Scrooge was older and looked meaner. He was talking with his sweetheart. She told him he cared more about money than about her, and gave him back his engagement ring. Next, he saw his sweetheart happily married to someone else, while he sat alone in his office with only a candle for company. "Take me away," he cried out, and suddenly he was in his own bedroom. He fell onto his bed and immediately sank into a deep sleep. Scrooge woke again with a jump, just as a clock was striking 2. A blaze of light seemed to be coming from the room next door. He heard a great booming voice calling him, "Come in, Scrooge!" Scrooge put on his slippers and shuffled to the door. His room looked quite different. It was decorated with holly, ivy, and mistletoe, and there was a huge crackling fire in the grate. Before it sat a jolly giant, holding a torch shaped like a horn of plenty.
"Come in, man, and get to know me," said the giant. "I am the ghost of Christmas present."
"Spirit," said Scrooge humbly, "I know you have come to do me good. Please take me with you." The spirit took him through the streets where people were doing their last-minute Christmas shopping until they came to a very small house. It belonged to Bob Cratchit, Scrooge's clerk. The Cratchits were all dressed up in honour of Christmas. Mrs. Cratchit and her daughters had shabby dresses, but they had decked them up with gay ribbons. Young Peter was wearing his father's starched wing collar, a little too big for him, and getting the corners caught in his mouth. He was sticking a fork into a bubbling saucepan of potatoes, while one of the girls was laying the table. Two excited little Cratchits, a boy and a girl, rushed in to say they were sure they could smell their goose cooking at the butcher's. "Where's your father and Tiny Tim?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "Here they come," said the children, and Bob, with Tiny Tim on his shoulder, came through the door. Tiny Tim carried a crutch and had an iron frame on his leg. Just then the young Cratchits came charging back, bearing the goose on a tray. Mrs. Cratchit heated up the gravy, and young Peter mashed the potatoes. The girls dished up the apple sauce and put out the hot plates. Everyone sat around the table, and Bob said grace. Then Mrs. Cratchit plunged her long carving knife into the goose's breast, and the smell of sage and onion stuffing came gushing out. They all said there was never such a tender, tasty goose. There was enough for everybody. The two young Cratchits, who were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows, feasted until they were about to burst. Next, it was time for the Christmas pudding. The room smelled like a washing day and baking day combined. Mrs. Cratchit carried in the pudding blazing with brandy and with a sprig of holly on top. Bob raised his glass. "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dear. God bless us." And Tiny Tim added, "God bless us, everyone." He sat close to his father, who held his thin little hand. "Spirit," whispered Scrooge, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live."
"I see an empty chair," said the spirit, "and beside it a little crutch. If these shadows do not change, Tiny Tim will not see another Christmas. But why should you care? Let him die. There are too many poor people." Then the spirit showed Scrooge what Christmas meant in far-away places. Suddenly, Scrooge heard a jolly laugh. It was Fred, his nephew. They were having a Christmas party. After a hilarious game of blind man's buff, they were playing a guessing game. Fred had to think of something and could only answer yes or no to questions. Yes, he was thinking of an animal, a disagreeable savage animal. Yes, it lived in London. No, it wasn't in a zoo. No, it wasn't a horse or a donkey or a bear. At last, Fred's plump sister-in-law squealed out, "I know who it is! It's your Scrooge!" And so it was. They all drank a toast to Uncle Scrooge, who would have answered them, but the spirit took him by the hand and whisked him away to see other people's Christmases in distant lands. But gradually the spirit grew smaller and smaller. Its brown hair turned to grey. "Is your life so short?" asked Scrooge.
"Yes, it ends at midnight."
Then Scrooge noticed something hiding in the folds of the spirit's robe. There were 2 children there, a boy and a girl, very thin, half-starved, and ragged.
"These are the children of the world who have no parents and no one to make a Christmas for them,"
said the spirit sadly. "Have they nowhere to go?" asked Scrooge.
"Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?"
The clock struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the spirit, but it was gone. Instead, he saw a solemn figure, clad in a dark hood and cloak, creeping towards him. It was the last of the spirits. The spirit did not speak. All Scrooge could see of it in the gloom was one outstretched hand, pointing from its black garments. Scrooge was filled with fear. "Are you the spirit of the future?" he asked, trembling. The spirit seemed to bend its head. "Will you not speak to me?" begged Scrooge. Instead, the spirit pointed straight ahead. They were in the city. The businessmen were standing in groups, chinking the gold coins in their pockets. Scrooge and the spirit stopped near enough to hear what some of them were saying.
"I don't know much about it. I only know he's dead," said one fat merchant. "Who's he left all his money to?" asked another, taking some snuff out of a large snuff-box. "I don't know," said a red-faced banker with a wart on his nose. "He hasn't left it to me." They all laughed. "I wonder who'll go to his funeral," said the fat man. "He hadn't any friends."
Scrooge wondered who they were talking about. He looked about for himself, but he was not in his usual place of business. He begged the spirit to show him some kinder feelings connected with the death. For an answer, the spirit took him to Bob Cratchit's house. The little Cratchits were quiet. Their mother was sewing. "Is your father coming?" she said. "He's late." "I think he walks slower now than he did with Tiny Tim on his shoulder," said Peter. Just then Bob came in, and his family hurried to get his tea. He had been to the cemetery. "It's a lovely place," said Bob. "I promised Tiny Tim we'd go there every Sunday. We must never forget Tiny Tim. We must never quarrel with each other, for he was so patient and good." Then they all hugged and kissed each other and made the promise. Scrooge said anxiously to the spirit, "Show me myself as I shall be in years to come." The tall, black figure led him to an iron gateway. It led to a neglected churchyard where the grass and nettles had grown high. The spirit stood among the graves, and its long finger pointed to one of them. Scrooge said, "Tell me, spirit, are these things that will happen, or are they things that may happen? Can they not be changed?" But the spirit stood still, pointing at the grave without speaking. On the stone, Scrooge read a name: Ebenezer Scrooge. "No, no," he cried, clutching the spirit's robe. "I am not that man. I will not be that man. Isn't there any hope for me? Can I change what you have shown me?" The spirit's hand trembled. "I promise to keep Christmas in my heart all the year round. I promise to remember the lessons the spirits have taught me. Please tell me I can change the writing on this stone." As he begged the spirit, he saw an alteration in its hood and dress. It shrank, collapsed, and changed into a bedpost. It was his own bedpost and his own bedroom, and it was his own time ahead of him to make up for the past. He scrambled out of bed and tore open the curtains. "What day is it?" he called out to a boy in the street below. "What day, sir? Why, Christmas Day." He had not lost any time after all. The spirits had shown him all their wonders in one night, and it was still Christmas morning. Scrooge took out some money. "Go down to the butcher's in the next street," he said, "and bring back the biggest turkey in the shop. Yes, that's right, the prize turkey. Get the man to come back with you so that I can tell him where to take it, and I'll give you £0.50." The boy ran off down the street. "I'll send it to Bob Cratchit," chuckled Scrooge. "He won't know where it's come from." After he had shaved and dressed up in his best suit, Scrooge went out. He smiled at all the people he met and wished them a Merry Christmas, and they returned the greeting. Then he spotted the plump gentleman who had been collecting for the poor. He went up and whispered in his ear. The plump gentleman looked amazed and delighted. "A great many back payments are included in that," Scrooge said. Next, he marched boldly up to his nephew's front door and rang the bell. "It's your Uncle Scrooge. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?" Of course he would. They had the most wonderful party, and Scrooge joined in it all. Games, dancing, and singing carols. Next morning, though, he was up early. He wanted to catch Bob Cratchit coming late to the office. Sure enough, poor Bob tried to sneak in unnoticed 1/4 of an hour after his usual time. Scrooge growled at him, pretending to be his old horrible self. "What do you mean by coming in at this time of day?" he snapped. "I'm very sorry," said Bob meekly. "It's only once a year." Scrooge said, "I'm not going to stand this sort of thing any longer," giving Bob a dig in the waistcoat. "And therefore," giving him another dig, "therefore, I am going to raise your wages. Bob thought Scrooge had gone mad.
A Merry Christmas, Bob, said Scrooge. A merrier Christmas than I have given you for many a year, my poor fellow. Make up the fire, let's have a real blaze, and fetch another bucket of coal. I'll look after your family and help Tiny Tim, and we'll brew up a hot toddy this afternoon to celebrate.
Ding dong merrily on high, in heaven our bells are ringing. Ding dong merrily the sky is lit with angels singing. Hosanna in excelsis.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and more, and to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city of London knew, or any city in the good old world. He saw no more spirits, but it was said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas as well as any man alive.